Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Susan Hearn, CEO of GME Solutions, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, GME Financial Principles for Teaching Hospitals. This is the second webinar in our GME Financial Management series. The objectives for the presentation today are as follows. Participants should be able to explain the necessary steps to prepare for graduate medical education, understand how CMS funding for GME is calculated, discuss setting a CMS GME funding cap, and introduce recent changes to regulations related to GME finance. Before I introduce today's speaker, there are a couple of housekeeping items to share. Participants have been muted upon entry. However, that doesn't always work. So if your audio is showing as unmuted, please change that to mute to eliminate background noise during the presentation. We've made every effort to reduce technical issues with the webinar presentation. If you have problems of any kind, please indicate them in a private chat to Hunter Rich on this platform. The slide presentation and webinar broadcast are provided exclusively for the use of registrants and should not be shared. Reproducing, distributing, or transmitting any session materials or the live presentation to any other group or individual requires express permission from GME Solutions. If you have questions throughout the session, please submit them in a chat feature. We'll be answering questions as they come up, as well as during a dedicated question and answer time at the end of the session. If we're not able to get through all the questions in the time allotted, or if you have a question that you don't want to include through public methods, you'll have the opportunity to submit them via email afterwards. Margo Flowers and Abby Wilson will serve as our chat facilitators. Every registered participant will receive an email containing a link to our survey so we can obtain feedback about the webinar. The survey is brief and we encourage your comments. Now let me introduce our speaker, Scott Mason, Manager of Finance, who will cover the history and basics of Medicare funding, assist you in understanding your institution's reimbursement rate, and review the associated costs of graduate medical education. Scott provides extensive experience in financial projections and pro formas utilizing methodologies that incorporate Medicare cost reports and Medicare GME reimbursement. His full biography is included in the webinar materials. Now let me turn the session over to our speaker.
Perfect. Thank you, Susan. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in this afternoon. So we will jump right in here. As Susan mentioned, this webinar is specifically focused on new teaching hospitals or new graduate medical education programs based at different hospitals. So we'll get started here. Preparing for graduate medical education. So we'll break it into really kind of 3 or 4 different areas where we talk about preparing once the residents get here and then ongoing monitoring. So the first one is really getting prepared for graduate medical education. There's a lot of rules and regulations that monitor and ensure that these training programs create very high functioning and well-qualified physicians. And we really recommend that there is a plan that's created before these programs get started. And I'll kind of walk through each of these 8 elements down below just to kind of get into a little bit more detail as to what we are talking about. For program sponsorship, before you start specific programs, there's required to be a sponsoring institution per the ACGME. This sponsoring institution could be something that's already created. If you partner with, say, a university or a medical school, this could be an existing sponsorship model. Or if you want to kind of take over the control for that, for those programs, all kind of within the health hospital and or health system, you can submit your own sponsoring institution application to the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit and what those timelines look like. As far as the program specialties go, this is probably what everybody thinks of when we think about these plans. What programs we want to start, which ones make the most sense, and then the resident complements at which size. So this is very important to keep in mind because, say, an internal medicine program may make sense, and then a family medicine program on the other side of things. These 2 programs by themselves, there may be a lot of opportunities or there may be a lot of offerings that would support these, but when they're put together, there may be some pain points within the health system. So we want to make sure that we're planning out as to where those residents are going, where they're training, and then if there's too much overlap in specific areas, and then we may need to reduce the size of one, or potentially maybe we should just go with internal medicine, or maybe we should go with just family medicine. So very important to identify which programs and at which complement for each one of those specific programs. And please, as we have questions, please feel free to put them in the box. I can't see much on my screen other than the slide, but feel free to put those in, and Abby or Margot or Susan will kind of stop me as we're going through to ask questions. For faculty requirements, this is very important as well. We get this a lot when we're working with our different clients where, say we're building a new cancer center and it's kind of just getting off the ground, but there's been a big investment. And the thought is we want to start a hematology oncology fellowship program. But in reality, we only have a few faculty members to support the program. We really want to, graduate medical education normally fits the best in the service lines that are created and well established rather than ones that are blossoming into something that we expect to be there in a few years. So we want to go through and make sure that we have all of the different faculty members that are board certified in those respective specialties before we start those programs. And it's very important to make sure all of their licensure is up to date and everything of the like. In a similar vein, for clinical training requirements, the best example that I can give is internal medicine. Obviously, we have to have internal medicine physicians in the inpatient and outpatient setting. But in addition to that, there's around 11 subspecialties that are required specifically in internal medicine, like cardiology, gastroenterology, nephrology, and the list goes on. But in addition to that, we also have psychiatry, emergency medicine, all kinds of different training requirements that are needed to support these programs. So for these clinical training requirements, it's not just the physicians in those respective specialties that we want to start. It's all of the other supporting experiences that make the programs really what they are. So making sure that we identify if there's any gaps. We have a plan in place to recruit those different physicians if we do have gaps, and then we can build it out from there. The costs. What is this going to cost us? And we'll get into this in a little bit more detail here related to some of the reimbursement side of things. But it's very important, too, to say, what is this going to cost us? And that really sets it up to say, is this going to be financially viable for a long time to come? And as I mentioned, we'll get into this a little bit more relative to the CAP development and the claiming of residents. The development timeline, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, this is not something that happens overnight. There's very specific deadlines that need to be hit, not only just for the sponsoring institution, but also for each and every program. Each review committee for each different specialty has a separate timeline for when they review applications and when they approve these in order to get started. And then to layer on top of that, there's very standardized timelines from, say, the match, where recruitment's normally towards the end of the year and into the spring. And then when they match in the spring, then they start in July of that, in that following July. But it also gets more complicated when we have different subspecialties where those recruitment dates may be a little bit different. So kind of with all this being said, there's a lot of different elements that go into this, and making sure that we have that plan in place is very, very important. This is just outlining, and we'll talk about too in a little bit here, why it's so important, because it's not like we have an infinite amount of time to do this. We have a very short and concise period where once we get started, we have to get it going very quickly. So when we look here at the institutional application, as I mentioned, there's different timelines for institutional, internal medicine, and emergency medicine. So if we wanted to get the institutional application started, it normally takes at least a few months to get that developed and submitted. Once we submit that, it's a waiting period. So when we would submit that, say in Q4 or Q1 of 2024, we have to wait for the agenda close, which would be in February. And then between February and May, we're really just at the mercy of the GME, waiting on their approval or disapproval of the sponsoring institution. So once we have a sponsoring institution approved, then we can get into specific programs. So look at internal medicine here. It's a little bit more complicated. I guess there's some other hurdles to cross for internal medicine. Not only do we have to develop and submit the application before the agenda close, there's also site visits that occur that the ACGME comes in to make sure, okay, this is what you wrote in the application. Is this really what's functioning, or is this really what's available for the residents? And they really just make sure that what you wrote is really true. But then from there, once the program's approved, they usually go through recruitment from the September to the February range. Match days normally in March, and then they would start in July of that following year. Emergency medicine follows a pretty similar timeline, but it's just a little bit different relative to when those specific deadlines fall for the ACGME and those respective specialties. Right. So things to consider before the residents arrive. So then this gets into a little bit the claiming of residents and making sure that we can build full reimbursement for them. So for rotation schedules, we want to make sure as part of the application process, there is rotation schedules that are required to be developed. As part of that rotation schedule development, we want to be mindful of a few things when we're creating those. For any of the rotations that occur outside of the hospital, or more specifically in a different hospital. If we think of a general surgery program, the general surgery program has a pediatric surgery requirement, and not a lot of larger hospitals have that. Normally, they have to be shifted to a pediatrics hospital. When the residents go out to another hospital separate and distinct from their own, they're unable to claim that time of the resident rotations. And therefore, even though we're, say, training 15 residents in a program, we may only be able to be reimbursed for, say, 14 of those 15 residents. And this is just something where we're always going to have some rotations that may have to go outside, but trying to, at least in the first couple of years, really being mindful of which rotations are going out versus what may be able to be satisfied within the hospital or within the health system. In addition to that, residents really do appreciate the experience to be able to go somewhere else and kind of and see how other programs work, or more specifically, if they're trying to go into a fellowship that's not available at the home institution, it's great to be able to give them an opportunity to kind of try out and get their foot in the door there. So there is one-off opportunities that we need to keep in mind, but for the most part, we want to try to keep those residents within the hospital or within those locations where that time can be claimed and reimbursed by CMS. One other thing that I just forgot to mention on the previous slide, when we're talking about building out these applications and getting them started, these are all pieces that have to be in place when the application is submitted. So that comes down to the program director, all of those different subspecialty physicians that I was mentioning. All of those different people have to be identified. Their CVs have to be collected. We have to make sure the board certifications are up to date. This is not something where we say, well, we want to do this and we're going to get the pieces and parts in place in the next year or so before the residents start. We have to have everything identified and planned out, and then it's a waiting process for the ACGME to approve that. So that's just a misconception that we see often when working with different clients. For the residency management software, there's a lot of different ones that our clients use, but this is something that's really developed and made to make everyone's life easier if it's used correctly. And we very much recommend trying to put as much information in there as possible, whether that's the didactic schedules, rotation schedules, anything related to the resident files, their board certificate or their medical, their exam scores, everything related to that. If it's all loaded in there, it makes everyone's life easier because it's a one-stop shop for a lot of this information. So this really comes down to the program coordinators or program managers to make sure that they're very much aware of what opportunities or what the opportunities within the residency management software are and how to utilize those. And also what's very important is what is the implication if they do not set those up correctly? Because if they, as we were talking about before, if they're identifying rotations that say that they aren't claimable, they may just think that this is something that they're not allowed to do, but this could significantly impact the reimbursement at the end of the day for the program long term. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Relative to the cost structure, the cost structure can be set up in a lot of different ways. And if there is anybody here who does have existing programs, feel free to put it into the chat. But we normally see it set up two different ways for the most part. One is if it's an internal medicine program, it's loaded into the internal medicine department budget. And then the other way is there's a kind of a pool for graduate medical education and the costs sit in this larger cost center, and then it's allocated out to the respective departments. We normally recommend having that centralized system, so then you can kind of bill out those costs to the respective areas. We normally find it's a little bit difficult to really tease out the GME related costs if they're buried in the departments. It certainly can be done. We just normally find that to be a little bit more difficult. But with that being said, when you all are planning for these residents to come, having those cost centers set up, having a structure that you know that works well within your system to allocate those costs, because once the residents get here, a lot of things are going on and you don't want those costs to, or if there's anything that's not set up correctly, we don't want that to snowball and make it more difficult down the road. So we can definitely touch on this towards the end if there are any comments or questions or recommendations from some of the people that may have programs currently. And I can't see the chat. Margot, Abby, is there anything specifically that I should answer to now compared to waiting?
Nothing yet.
Okay. So when the residents arrive, so I'll just go through quickly how the reimbursement formulas work. So this little pie chart on the right, for some of our current clients, we do like to use this pie chart a lot, so it may be familiar to you. But this is just a visual representation of how much these different funding mechanisms are worth. So you'll see the IME, or the indirect medical education payments, are around 2/3 of the total payments. The DGME is around 1/3, and the capital IME is just a smaller portion there, where I wouldn't even say it. It's not even enough to really quantify as far as a fraction goes. But for the DGME, these are intended to cover the costs directed with graduate medical education, such as resident stipends, fringe benefits, and faculty protected time. The factors that impact this are the PRA, or the per resident amount, which we'll talk about in more detail here in a second, the FTE cap, and the Medicare utilization of the hospital. This is another common misconception where clients confuse potentially the Medicare utilization of the residents and the patients that they see versus actually what the entire hospital is seeing. So this information comes directly from the CROSS report, and it's not really who the patients are seeing, it's just the patient population the hospital serves. For indirect medical education, this is an add-on payment to the DRG payments. And the biggest thing that factors in here is the intern to resident to bed ratio, intern and resident to bed ratio. So you can't impact this one too much, other than potentially if you have beds and you can reduce the number of beds that are in service, this can help potentially increase your reimbursement on a per resident basis. But for the most part, this is a relatively formulaic calculation, and what comes out of it is really just the classifications of the hospital itself. And then the capital indirect payments, similar to IME, this is a capital DRG add-on payment, which is meant to offset some of the overhead costs of graduate medical education. These different funding structures, these aren't specifically identified for graduate medical education. There isn't a reporting structure that says you received $2 million for IME and DGME payments. How did you spend this money to support graduate medical education? Normally, we see our clients, they very closely monitor the DGME payments, because this is, as we'll talk about here on the next slide, they come as a biweekly payment to the hospitals. So when this comes in, this is tracked, and then this is kind of given to the GME department relative to help support their operations. The IME, as I mentioned before, it's a little bit more difficult to track and quantify, simply because it's an add-on payment to DRGs. So, and this is not just the DRGs related to resident service, this is for the entire hospital. So when we're tracking this, it's more of a projection to say, this is how much we expect to come in this year. And then we have to true it up to see, okay, is this exactly what came in? And then it could be allocated over. But more often than not, this is really just goes to the hospital to help offset some of the costs of the residency program, and it's not traditionally allocated to the GME budgets. At the end of the day, our argument is the hospital would not be receiving this IME add-on factor if residents were not currently in the hospital. And this really should be going to offset the cost of graduate medical education. But just kind of passing along some of the things that we see and some of the feedback that we're receiving when we're working through this with our various clients. Very important note here at the bottom. These payments start as soon as the residents start training. So there's normally a fair amount of startup costs that happen before the residents are actually on campus. But if you go through the necessary steps with your auditor, you will be paid July 1 of when those residents start within the hospital. And the other thing to keep in mind that's very important is during this ramp up time for these residents, because say we have an internal medicine program of 30 residents, you're going to have 10 the first year, 20 the second year, 30 the third year. The payments that you receive in the first year are going to be very different than what are in the second year and the third year. So you need to be in constant communication with your auditors during this ramp up period to make sure you're getting the money when you're incurring the costs, rather than this being a true up after the fact at the end of the academic year, end of the cost reporting year. The one slide that I skipped over quickly. This is just a screenshot of some of the projections we do for our clients relative to estimating what their reimbursement would be at a respective hospital. So this is obviously very important when we talked earlier about creating those budgets or creating those pro formas. We want to make sure that those projections are spot on, so we have the revenue side of things, and then we can account for the costs correctly to say, this is what type of investment we're expecting. This is how much we need to kind of break even. But a lot of these projections can be taken from taking the right pieces and parts from the Medicare cost report and estimating out how many residents that we think are going to be operating at these respective hospitals. And this isn't something that's standardized. If we look at hospitals across the street from each other, these can vary very significantly between those hospitals. And it's really dependent upon what services are available at the hospital, how large the hospital is, and some other factors that it's not a one size fits all, even if they're within the same health system or if they're located within the same area. So more recently, there was a change to how the cap is set at hospitals. And before these regulation changes, if you accepted residents from a new program, it was called the mere presence policy. If a new teaching resident was rotating to a hospital, we always say that it's radioactive. If that resident rotated there, it would automatically start the cap development period for those respective hospitals, even if they weren't planning on it. There was a recent change with the Consolidated Appropriations Act that gave a little bit more flexibility for this, because now they say you have to train at least 1.0 FTE in order to trigger the cap development period. So this is great, because if there's, say, a one-off rotation, I'll use the pediatric surgery example again. If we have one resident physician who's coming over to get an experience in pediatric surgery, this wouldn't trigger the cap in an otherwise non-teaching hospital. We would have to exceed that 1.0 FTE in order to start that cap development process. Furthermore, if you look at the bottom of the slide here, if you do have less than 1.0 FTE, no reporting is required. And previously, this is something that was required. And just to take one step into the weeds here real quick for any of the locations that have existing teaching programs, there used to be a pre-PRA base period or a cost-based reimbursement period before the programs got started. And this helped offset some of the startup costs and things like that. But with this change to the legislation, it essentially eliminated the pre-PRA base period. So it goes back to what I mentioned before, where the residents really start getting reimbursed from when they start training, and that's traditionally July 1st. The one item that we just wanted to point out, we think about 1 FTE as having one person there throughout the full year. So But it gets relatively difficult when we say a 30-person program is only rotating one of their residents for a month, but there's a person there for, say, the full month. Or if you can see in this table down below, in January, February, and March, there's really not many FTEs that are rotating through there. But you look through, and then October, November, December, say there's specific rotations that they need to get to, and everyone wants to get to it by the end of the year. As soon as that 1.0 threshold is elapsed, that's when they need to start claiming, and then that's when the PRA would need to be started. And going to a little bit more detail on the per PRA or the per resident amount, this is the cost that CMS deems as what the appropriate cost of training a resident is. And there's a lot of formulas behind it as to how this is established. But for the most part, we want to make sure that we're allocating costs related to training the residents. If we don't, it can be very impactful in a negative way to the funding of the programs long term. So this is something where we want to be very mindful, where we say, well, it's only one resident coming from general surgery, it's only one coming from internal medicine, and we don't have many rotations coming here at all. We're still able to build programs. We could be exceeding that 1.0 FTE and setting that cap inadvertently. For the per resident amount, as I mentioned before, a hospital's PRA is established when the hospital trains at least 1.0 FTE. And once the PRA is established, it's permanent and cannot be modified or reset. And there was recent regulation changes that came out that allowed older teaching hospitals to reset their PRA if it was set artificially low. But moving forward now, once that's set, it's really kind of stays as is. There's inflation factors that are applied year over year to give them a modest increase, but that's not something where if you don't account for those costs properly in that first year, it can be set artificially low. So it's very important to make sure that the correct costs are going to the correct area in the cost report to set that PRA correctly to make sure that you have the long-term funding for those programs. And more specifically, we just see over here on the right side how that PRA is utilized in that formula. If we account for the cost correctly, I would say it's anywhere traditionally from $90,000 to $110,000 or $120,000 per resident. If we set that correctly, it's then multiplied by the Medicare utilization, then multiplied by the number of FTEs we have a funding cap for, and that equals your total DGME reimbursement. If this PRA is set lower, you can see how this just incrementally decreases the total reimbursement that will be received. And furthermore, we've seen hospitals where they set this PRA at $0 because they didn't account for their costs correctly. And it essentially wipes out the DGME side of funding, or a third of your total graduate medical education funding. So this is something that's very important to make sure it's being accounted for correctly, and you're going to set up that reimbursement stream for a long time to come in the future. So setting the cap, as I mentioned before, in talking about the planning and why that's so important for new programs. For urban hospitals, you only have 5 years to start all programs, and that number is built to the cap that I've been referring to. For rural hospitals or rurally classified hospitals, you have the opportunity to build on a program by program basis, with each program having a 5-year period to develop its cap. So CMS, when they were looking at this and setting these rules, they identified that it's more difficult to start programs in rural areas. You don't have as many nearby hospitals, there's not as many resources, and they gave this flexibility, which said, we will allow you to have more time to build up these programs. And I think this illustration below kind of shows it in a great way, because you can see internal medicine, family medicine, general surgery, OB, cardiovascular disease, and neurology. In the rural example, all of these programs were able to start and create cap. For the urban hospital, you can see that internal medicine, family medicine, general surgery, and obstetrics, those were the programs that were started because it was within that first 5-year period. But cardiovascular disease and neurology, both of those are going to be outside the cap. And when I say outside the cap, you're going to say have a cap of, say, 50 FTEs from those first programs in the green. But any of those FTEs from cardiovascular disease and neurology, you get no additional funding for those residencies because it was built outside of the 5-year cap development period for the urban hospital. I want to bring your attention to the top right of both of these tables, the internal medicine expansion. So it's very important to note that if you're expanding an existing program, whether that's for an urban hospital or a rural hospital, if you're doing that outside of the cap development period, you are not going to receive funding for that respective program. So let's go back to the internal medicine program. So say during our planning process, well, we want to start every program at a minimum program size and get started. And everybody signs off and says, okay, let's move forward with this. The difficult part about that is, say you want to expand that internal medicine program. Once you're at full complement at the end of that 3rd year, you only have 2 years to expand your resident complement. And with that being said, there's specific accreditation that you have to have from the Accreditation Council of Graduate Medical Education to get those started. So you're playing with 2 years here, and if you don't get that accreditation and get the additional residents recruited into that program by the end of that 5th academic year, you're not going to be able to get to the program size and develop that cap appropriately. So that's really where it comes down to creating a robust strategy from the beginning to make sure that those residency positions are the right sized programs. So then you can have the funding caps to support those into the future. And just the one thing I'll just touch on briefly that we'll talk about actually in the next webinar is the rural reclassification opportunities. And this is really a loophole, more or less, that allows hospitals to change from that urban classification to the rural classification and be able to have more flexibility to create additional cap above and beyond what they had set in their traditional cap development period, whether that was set in 1996 or whether that was set in previous years when they were starting new programs. But it's really a great opportunity to take advantage of some of the rural rules for urban hospitals. And 600 hospitals across the country have gone through and done this rural reclassification for various reasons. But one of the main reasons is for graduate medical education support and development. So this is a question that we get very often, and not just with new programs, but also with existing programs, and what residency activities can be counted. So we'll go through some of these, of the ones that can be counted, and then also the ones that cannot be counted. The first one, which is the most straightforward, is residence within a hospital setting. So if we have a hospital that's starting a new program, they are a historically non-teaching hospital. When they're rotating in the hospital or a provider-based clinic, this time would be able to be claimed and help create the cap for that respective program. For a non-hospital setting, so I think of this related to a private physician office or the continuity clinic for the respective programs, more so primary care. You can claim this time, but you have to incur the stipend and fringe benefits when they're training at these sites. Vacation and orientation. This is time where it is able to be claimed. So normally there's anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks if they get vacation. This can be identified in the rotation schedules or in the residency management software, but this time is allowable and can be claimed. And similarly for orientation, some places only have a few days, but some have 2 weeks or more. So that time is able to be claimed as well. For a leave of absence or for family medical leave, this time is allowable as long as it does not extend the training of the resident beyond the minimum training years for that program. And for example, if you have to take off for, say, 2 months for a specific reason, there may be 2 months of flexibility within the training program where maybe an elective or kind of double dipping on the previous rotations that you had already completed. As long as they can still get through, say, the 3 years of training minus those 2 months, all of that time can be claimed. But if it's a 3-year program and it takes the resident 3.5 years to complete that, those additional that time during that they're taking off, it would not be able to be claimed and build cap for that time to claim reimbursement moving forward in the future. So what activities cannot be counted? And this kind of reinforces what I was speaking about earlier. If it's in another hospital, even if you're paying for it, it cannot be claimed by the home institution. So I'll go back to the pediatric surgery example. If we have to send that out for pediatric surgery and then they're doing inpatient rotations at another hospital, you cannot claim that time when it rotates over there. Research in any hospital. So the one gray area here is, well, is it bench research or is it part of a research trial? That time is not able to be counted no matter what. If they're doing research to say, how do I care for this patient that I have coming up tomorrow or I have on the surgery schedule coming up this week, that time is claimable. So usually we say if it's patient-centered research, it is claimable, but bench research is not. A non-hospital setting, and this kind of refers back to the previous slide. If you do not pay the resident stipend and fringe benefits when they're rotating to the non-hospital setting, you cannot claim that time. You have to be able to demonstrate that you're paying the time of the residents when they rotate there. And then extension of training, if they need to go over that allocated time, we call it the initial residency period. So for internal medicine, it'd be 3 years, family medicine 3 years, general surgery 5 years. If they go outside that time, that is not able to be claimed. So determining the cap, and this goes back to the table that we had earlier with the green and the red, and talking through if we started those programs in the first 5 years, they would help develop cap. That's a question we do get very frequently to say, if we start a program in the first year, say start an internal medicine program, and then in the third year, we start a general surgery program. The last 2 years of the general surgery program, since it's 5 years of training, would not technically be in that cap development period. Do we get the cap for that? And kind of this is the formula that CMS uses. And then we'll walk through an example on the following 2 slides to illustrate exactly how it occurs. So for the first step is identifying the maximum allowable cap. So after the 5 year of cap development concludes, the year with the largest number of resident FTEs is multiplied by the duration of the program. So if we're looking across and we see, okay, well, 1 year is filled to 10 and 1's to 8, we would count that 10, and then it's multiplied by the duration of the program. So as I mentioned before, internal medicine's 3 years, general surgery is 5 years. So then the cap would be created from there. Next, we identify the percent of training occurring at each one of the different hospitals. So if we know that 60% is occurring at the main site and 40% is at a secondary site within the health system, we would take those 30 FTEs, multiply by the 60%. That would be the cap that would be assigned to the home institution, and then the 40% of that 30 FTEs will be assigned to that secondary training site where the residents were getting their experiences. And I kind of just already talked about the third step there, but that's how that cap is allocated to those respective sites, taking the maximum allowable, identifying training percentage, and then allocating the cap out respectively. And this is just a visual kind of talking about what I just went through. So the example here is at Hospital A, they have a 30-person internal medicine program, and we recruit 10 residents per year and are operating in a full size by year 3. So you can see from 10 to 20 to 30, and then you can see they're recruiting residents through. The MAC, or the Medicare Administrative Contractor, set the cap based on the information collected in year 5. And what we specifically want to illustrate here is, say, for example, in year 5, one PGY level, they didn't recruit or a resident was released from the program for whatever reason, we would still be able to build the full funding cap for that program because we still have 10 residents in the first 2 years. So we have the highest number of training multiplied by the length of training, which gives us 30 FTEs. So this is something that's very important when we're building out these programs. Say we start program in the 4th or 5th year of our cap development period. If we start that, we really want to make sure that we can fully fill those classes, because if not, say we start in the 5th year and we want to have 10 in each class, and say we only match 5 or 8, maybe 8's a more realistic example, we would only get 24 FTEs for that program instead of 30. So that's just very important to keep in mind, especially when we're building out that plan to make sure that we have the most time possible to build and try to fill those classes to the fullest level to get CAP to support the program in the future. This is just an example talking about the different academic years. And this is just kind of a illustration where it says if we have 20 residents in the first year, 40, 60, jump into 120, 150, and then 155. After this cap is set in this year right here, and we have 150 FTEs, we can continue to train more and more residents. And you'll see this with a lot of large academic institutions. They have a cap of, say, 200 FTEs and they're training 450. There's not a limit as to how many residents you can train, but there is a limit on how much funding that those respective residents are going to receive. So when we're looking at this, when we get to that cap, that's the maximum number of reimbursement that we're going to receive. Anything above and beyond that, it's kind of just diluting the pool, because if we look at it on a per resident basis, we're going to have more residents, but we're going to have the same totality of reimbursement to be shared to support GME as a whole. One of the items that we recommend is IRIS analyses, and the IRIS is the Intern and Resident Information System. This is a report created by the residency management software, usually MedHub, New Innovations, My Evaluations, whatever that may be. And what this does is this report is submitted to the auditors with the cost report at the end of each year to say, these are the residents that are here. And anybody that currently has teaching programs, these are those overlap reports that you received earlier this year that said, hey, your hospital along with another hospital both claim the time for these residents. Who actually gets to claim these residents? And so why we recommend doing these IRIS analyses is we want to make sure that this cap is created properly, because say, for example, if we didn't claim vacation time, or we didn't claim valid research time, or a continuity clinic wasn't set up properly in the residency management software, we could potentially be missing out on a lot of reimbursement for these residents, not just this year, but that cap wouldn't be set properly in perpetuity. So the process that we normally do to make sure that all the residents are accounted for is we consolidate the IRIS reports. So we take that from all the different programs, and if it's a health system, we kind of put it into one file to make sure we have accounting for a full 1.0 FTE of all those different residents. Depending upon the residency management software, some of these do this in different reports, but we also find that those reports sometimes inadvertently omit or say that they're claiming respective time. So we really try to do this to make sure we see from July 1 to June 30th, we can follow the full rotation of where a resident has been. If there are any missing rotations, we can make sure that those time periods are either claimable or not claimable and confirm that. And then if there are FTEs, which we can claim, we can amend and refile those reports to make sure that cap is set correctly. And on the next slide here, this talks about kind of the two areas of caution for the cap development and making sure that the cap is set correctly. During the cap development period, we want to make sure the cap's set at the right level, because if we set the cap too high, we could potentially be getting interim payments, and then we're going to have to pay back money because we said that the cap was too high. So we want to make sure that we're kind of right on the money. If there's a small variance at the end of the year, that may be expected. But if there's a few FTEs, this could be hundreds of thousands of dollars that we would have to pay back. So making sure that that time is very well accounted for is very important to make sure the funding is coming in correctly. The other word of caution is we may be setting the cap too low. As I mentioned on the previous slide, if we intentionally or unintentionally omitted specific rotations or rotation types, that cap could be set low. So say we're supporting a 30-person internal medicine program, we may only have 25 cap to support that program, when in reality, it should be a full 30 FTEs to support that residency program moving forward. So we want to make sure that all of that data is in there correctly, especially when we're nearing the end of our cap development period, because it's not just the reimbursement today that's being hurt. This is the reimbursement forever for the hospital. Once that cap is set, that is with the hospital forever. So making sure that we are accounting for these different areas properly is very, very important. And just kind of a teaser for the November 14th webinar. We're just going to talk about some of the things that we're seeing in the industry and what's been changing more recently and what we expect to change in the future. The big ones are Consolidated Appropriations Act, which came out in 2020 and were enacted into legislation in 2021. Affiliation agreements between institutions. This gives them the availability to share cap from one hospital to another. Rural designation, as I mentioned before, it's kind of a loophole, but it's really providing a lot of opportunity for graduate medical education expansion at previously capped hospitals at places all across the country. And just to be clear, when we see rural, we're not talking about hospitals located in rural areas. There's hospitals in Miami, Florida, New York City, Los Angeles, anywhere that you could think is the most populated areas. These hospitals are taking advantage of these rules and regulations to benefit them. State funding, we've seen a lot of changes in state funding recently, specifically related to graduate medical education. And then the IPPS rules were just finalized in August, making sure that we understand those and what potential advantages or disadvantages that they may be having on graduate medical education. But I believe that is it. We'll open it up for questions here. But please, you can see the QR codes here. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us. Ian's email is also on the screen as well.
So we'll now open the floor for questions from the audience. If you have a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A box. And we're going to start with one that we've received earlier. Is there any way to get more cap once you finished your cap development period?
Yeah, so there's very specific options for that. One is partnering with rural hospitals to do rural training tracks or rural training programs. Those build cap at the rural sites as well as at the home urban institution. The other opportunity for that is the rural reclassification, as I was just mentioning. And the final one that we'll talk about on the next webinar is there was the CMS allocated 1,000 new teaching positions, and it's an application basis where the hospitals in the most need, they can apply and they may be awarded one of those 1,000 positions. So in general, there's not many opportunities to do that, but there are a few loopholes to be able to expand your cap.
And Scott, for some of those with the consolidated appropriations that you've mentioned, how long has it been since something like that occurred in the past?
It's been a long time. It was back in the Affordable Care Act where they redistributed some of the non-used cap across the country. But since then, this has been one of the biggest changes to graduate medical education and being able to provide additional funding for hospitals.
Thank you. And there's a question, is the per resident allocation not adjusted for inflation?
It is adjusted for inflation. There is a year-over-year adjustment that increases it incrementally. But if whatever it's set at, that inflation factor is going to increase it. So if it's set low, it's still going to increase, but we want to make sure that it's maximized in that first year.
Thank you. And another clarifying question. If I start an IM program in 24-25 with 2 residents in each year until 28-29, when I recruit, a PGY 5, my cap would be 15. Is that correct based on my PGY 1 cohort?
Sorry, let me clarify.
Yeah.
The question says when I recruit 5 PGY 1s in the 28-29 year, not a PGY 5.
Sorry.
Got
You're
it.
okay.
So the class with the highest number of residents in the 5th year, that would be setting your cap. So it'd be the 5 residents multiplied by the duration of the program, which would be 15, even if it in the preceding years was only 2 residents. Like one other question.
Back to the inflationary adjustment. Does this apply only to primary care?
That's a good question. Normally, when we see that come through, I'm just thinking about the hospitals that we look at. There is sometimes a variance between the primary care and the other programs as they term it. I'll follow up with you, Justin, to make sure I have a clear answer on that. I haven't got that question before.
And I have one last question, unless someone else chimes in here in another minute. Is Medicare funding the only way I can receive funding for GME?
So there are other funding opportunities, specifically at the state level, but also HRSA has put together different funding mechanisms. Obviously, this is a federal organization as well, but it is different than CMS. They put together funding mechanisms specifically for children's hospitals because, as you would expect, children's hospitals do not have a high Medicare utilization. So it wipes out a lot of the funding that you would think would be available. But normally between the state, federal level, whether that's CMS or HRSA, the only other funding mechanisms that we see is from foundations or kind of generous donors, those types of things. So those are the 3 main areas to provide funding for graduate medical education.
Got it. So thank you to our presenter for the information and insights provided today. In wrapping up our session, we want to thank all of you for participating. As noted earlier, you'll receive an email this afternoon with a short survey to complete, as well as a copy of the presentation. If you have any outstanding questions after today's presentation, please email Ian Sullivan. We have it there on the screen, isullivan@germainsolutions.com. And then for additional GME educational content, we will also be hosting GME Financial Principles for Non-Teaching Hospitals later this year. Upcoming details and registration information for this webinar will be found on LinkedIn and on our website. Since this is a series, our marketing team will ensure that every participant in this webinar will receive an email containing the sign-up link for the upcoming webinar. To be included in the important future announcements, follow Germain Solutions on LinkedIn or contact us on the website. Thank you again for your participation in today's webinar.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.